Senior recognition night at the football game, and the cheerleaders put this sign. There goes Scott by the sign. All right, number 50, you're covering up Jeff. Put that sign in the yard, and there's black and orange balloons. So we're off to the football game.
The Sharon Tigers against Johnstown Bishop McCoy. This evening, the Sharon High School would like to honor the senior members of the 1990 football team, cheerleading squad, and their parents. On behalf of the administration, faculty, and friends, we thank you for a job well done. This time, directing your attention to the 50-yard line, we present number 2, Michael Archie. Tailback, linebacker, Michael is escorted by his mother, Miss Denny Archie.
It's hard to keep this thing steady.
Number 63, Arsenio Basilis, guard, defensive tackle, accompanied by Mr. and Mrs. Bill Lott.
One of Jeff's friends from the football team.
Number 89, Rich Canone, tight end, defensive end, son of Mr. and Mrs. Rich Canone. Our next senior, number 37, Bob Coop, tailback, defensive end, son of Mrs. Dolores Coop. Bob is escorted tonight by football coach Dan Snyder. Senior, number 7, Marcus Cheek. Wide receiver, defensive back, escorted by his mother, Mrs. Audrey Cheek. Senior, number 70, Alex Simo, guard, defensive tackle, accompanied by his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Gary Simo. Senior, number 1, Blaine Coleman, wide receiver, linebacker, son of Mrs. Elizabeth Townsend. Senior, number 27, Ed Biscuit, wide receiver, linebacker, son of Mrs. Cynthia Atkins. Senior, number 3, Billy Jackson, wide receiver, defensive back, escorted by his father, Mr. Bill Jackson. Senior, number 57, Tom Jones, center, linebacker, accompanied by his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Walter Jones. Senior, number 85, Frank Cleric, tight end, linebacker, son of Mr. and Mrs. Al Cleric. senior, number 66 and 84, Sean Mackin. Tackle, defensive tackle, son of Mr. Sharon Wheat and Mr. David Mackin.
Watch this. I can make a long journey.
Senior manager, number 32, Jeff Plow, son of Mr. and Mrs. Frank Plow, Jr.
It's starting to get heavy.
Our next senior, number 5, Clem Raxter, wide receiver, defensive back. Escorting him is his mother, Mrs. Gwendolyn Raxter. Our next senior, number 79, Chuck Ray, tackle, defensive end, and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Ray. Our next senior, number 8, Tony Reardon, quarterback, linebacker, escorted by his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Leo Reardon. Our next senior, number 51, Jim Sloan, center, defensive tackle, son of Mrs. Frances Sloan and Mr. James Sloan.
There he is.
Our next senior, number 67, Jeff Squires, tackle, defensive tackle, son of Mr. and Mrs. John Squires. Our next senior football player, number 4, Mike Washington. Wide receiver, defensive back, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. John Washington. Our next senior, number 68, Kurt Wheeler. Guard, defensive tackle, son of Mrs. Beverly Wheeler. Our next senior manager, number 16, Terry Zonheiser, son of Mr. and Mrs. Terry Zonheiser. Senior football player, number 44, Donovan Zuck, fullback, linebacker, son of Mr. and Mrs. Larry Zuck.
These are all the cheerleaders.
Our senior cheerleader, Janice Aiken, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. James Aiken. David Bastress, son of Mr. Charles Bastress, escorted tonight by our cheerleading advisor, Mrs. Andrew Haley. Our next senior cheerleader, Christine Burdett, daughter of John and Dean Burnett. Mr. and Mrs. William C. Gillette.
Mom, this thing is getting really heavy.
They're almost done.
It's hard to keep my arms straight.
Senior cheerleader Aaron Lucas, daughter of Susan Lucas and Robert Lucas.
Oops, bumped it.
Senior cheerleader Allison Miller, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Donald Miller. Senior Megan Moss, escorted by her parents, Richard and Cheryl Moss. Senior Jennifer Patterson, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jack Patterson. Senior Dawn Sutton and her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Robano.